You know more of these visions than you think. Peter, a rooftop in Joppa, a sheet descending from the sky, filled with animals the Jewish law called unclean, a voice telling him, eat. For centuries, this passage has been read as God removing the food restrictions. But 12 verses after the vision ends, still in the same chapter, Peter gives the interpretation himself, at Acts chapter 10 verse 28. God has shown me that I should not call any person common or unclean. Not a ruling about diet, a declaration about people. The vision wasn't about the sheet, it was about who was allowed through the door. And Peter says so himself, in the same chapter, in his very first words to Cornelius' household. The text gave the answer, 12 verses later. Most readers never got there. This is the pattern. Across more than 50 visions recorded in both the Old and New Testaments, the Bible almost always answers its own questions. The famous misreadings exist not because the answer was missing, but because the reader stopped before it arrived. This video covers the full catalog, 50+ visions, organized by era from the patriarchs through the book of Revelation, tracking one thread across all of them. Which visions did the Bible interpret for you, and which ones does it leave open? What did Ezekiel see in the valley of dry bones? The text gives the interpretation in plain language, in the same chapter. Most people have never been told what it says. What was the structure Jacob saw in his sleep? Because the Hebrew word used in that passage does not mean what most English readers have been taught to picture. And why has Daniel's most important vision generated 3 separate theological traditions that reach completely opposite conclusions? Not because the text is silent, because scholars disagree about how far the text's own answer extends. 50 visions. One question. Did the Bible already tell you? To answer it, you need to know something most English readers have never been taught, because there is not one word for vision in the Old Testament. There are 5. So which word was used when, and how does the choice of word change what the vision actually meant? There is a specific frustration that comes from reading a map in the wrong language. All the roads are there, the distances are accurate, the map is perfectly useful to someone who knows what the words mean. For everyone else, it is a beautiful object with a puzzle at its center. Most English-speaking readers of the Bible assume one word underlies every vision in a text. It does not. The Old Testament uses at least 5 distinct Hebrew words for visionary experience, and each carries different weight. They distinguish between visions by the level of consciousness involved, the directness of the divine communication, and the density of symbolic content. English translations flatten all 5 into one word, vision. The original text was not that careless. The most common of these words is hazon. It refers to a formal prophetic vision, usually one that carries a message or a commission. It is the word used for the book of Isaiah, identified in its opening verse as the hazon that Isaiah received across 4 reigns. It is the word Daniel uses to frame the visions of chapters 7 through 12. It is the word in Habakkuk chapter 2, where God tells the prophet to write the hazon on tablets and make it plain. Now here is the detail most readers have never seen. In 1 Samuel chapter 3 verse 1, the text uses hazon with an explicit scarcity statement. The word of the Lord, it reads, was rare in those days. Hazon was not widespread, not forbidden, not impossible, rare. The text is describing a declared spiritual drought, a period when God had gone quiet in a way that everyone in Israel would have recognized and felt. Samuel's calling in the same chapter arrives into that silence as a rupture rather than a continuation. The rarity was the message. If you have ever sat in a season that felt spiritually empty and wondered whether the silence itself meant something, that verse in 1 Samuel is doing something deliberate. The scarcity of hazon was not a narrative detail. It was a theological condition being named. The other 4 words round out the system without needing names attached. There is a word for the dream vision received during sleep, a word for an overwhelming visual appearance, a word so rare it appears only 4 times in the entire Old Testament, reserved for the most direct kind of encounter, and a word for nighttime visions, often connected with divine speech. When you know which word the text chose, you know what kind of encounter is being described before the details begin. That precision was built into the original language. Most English translations have not kept it. The catalog of visions begins before any of these prophetic categories fully developed. It begins in the dark, in the sleep of a single man, in a field somewhere in the hill country of Canaan. And why did the text answer the question almost before he could ask it? Most people do not notice how dark it is when the great visions begin. Not dark as in threatening, dark as in night, as in sleep, as in the hour when the world goes quiet and something else gets loud. In Genesis chapter 15, Abram falls into a deep sleep. The text uses a specific Hebrew word for the trance, the same one used for Adam's sleep when Eve is formed. What Abram sees is a smoking firepot and a blazing torch passing between the halves of animals he has arranged in 2 rows. The word the text uses for the type of encounter is the rarest of the 5 Hebrew vision words, only 4 times in the entire Old Testament. The interpretation is provided in the same passage immediately. God speaks the covenant terms into the vision. The land from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates will belong to Abram's descendants. The fire and the torch are the sign. The speech is the explanation. The text does not leave the reader guessing. The vision in Genesis chapter 28 is the most visually famous in the patriarchal catalog. Jacob falls asleep on a stone in the wilderness and sees what most readers have been taught to picture as a rope ladder going up to heaven. The Hebrew word the text uses is sulam. It appears nowhere else in the entire Old Testament, not once, and the word does not mean rope ladder. Most modern translations, including the NIV, render it stairway or staircase. Historians of the ancient Near East note that the image is architecturally consistent with a Mesopotamian temple ramp, the kind of wide, ceremonial staircase that ascended a ziggurat to the divine space at the summit. The angels in the vision are not climbing rungs, they are ascending a monumental approach structure. If you have ever pictured Jacob asleep under a thin vine-covered ladder, the painting that image came from is beautiful. It is also the wrong image. The Hebrew word was unusual enough that the original readers would have noticed. A normal word for staircase exists in Hebrew. The writer chose the unusual one. That kind of care is everywhere in this catalog, if you know to look. Think about what the difference in scale does to the scene. A rope ladder is intimate, almost domestic. A stone temple ramp is architectural on the scale of a monument. God stands at the top and renews the Abrahamic promise. The staircase was not the point. The speech was. And the speech was the answer. If you have ever been so distracted by a striking image that you missed the words spoken inside it, that is the precise misreading the Hebrew text is trying to prevent. The third major patriarchal vision comes from an unexpected source. In Numbers chapter 24, Balaam, a non-Israelite diviner hired to curse Israel, delivers a vision oracle and introduces it with the phrase. The word used is that same rarest of the 5 vision terms, the one from Genesis 15. Balaam is not an Israelite prophet. He is not part of the covenant lineage. But the text assigns him the rarest vision word and puts in his mouth a prophecy about a star from Jacob. The text is not troubled by the source. It records what was said. So what happens when the visions grow larger? When the prophet does not sleep? When the encounter is not in the dark of a single night, but in a throne room, in the light, in a place the prophet is not sure he can survive? There is a word that engineers use when they want to be precise about uncertainty. They do not say, I do not know, they say, within tolerances. It means this is as accurate as the instrument can measure. What you are about to get is not vague. It is controlled precision in the face of something that exceeded the instrument. Isaiah chapter 6 opens in the throne room of God. The year is given. It is the year King Uzziah died. The specificity is deliberate. Isaiah sees the Lord seated on a high and lofty throne, his robe filling the temple. Above him, seraphim with 6 wings each, 2 covering their face, 2 their feet, 2 for flight, calling out, Holy, holy, holy. Isaiah's response is collapse. Woe is me. I am ruined. I am a man of unclean lips. A seraph flies to him with a live coal from the altar and touches his mouth. Then the text gives the full interpretation in the same passage. Isaiah is commissioned, not to inspire the people, to harden them. Go and tell this people. Keep listening but do not understand. Keep looking but do not perceive. The throne room vision is not a comfort. It is a call to a difficult assignment the text describes honestly and in full. Notice what just happened. One of the most visually overwhelming encounters in the Old Testament ends not with inspiration, but with a commission to speak to people who will not listen. Isaiah leaves the throne room undone, not energized. The text does not soften that, and the interpretation is provided in the same scene. There is nothing left to decode. If you have ever opened a Bible looking for comfort and walked away with a hard assignment instead, you have read the same room, because it described something so far beyond normal language that the risk of misreading it was high. Do you hear what Ezekiel is doing? He describes the vision in elaborate detail, and then uses 3 compounding qualifiers to tell you he cannot fully describe what he saw. That is not contradiction. That is the most honest account possible of something that exceeded the capacity of language to contain it. Here is the mental image most people carry for Ezekiel chapter 37. Bones reassembling, flesh returning, a field of the dead rising to life. For centuries, this passage has been preached as a vision of individual bodily resurrection. The bones standing up are you, one day, at the final resurrection. That reading has enormous resonance. It has shaped funeral sermons and Easter homilies across traditions for 2,000 years. Think of a book with footnotes. Every time the author makes a surprising or difficult claim, a small number appears in the margin. If you flip to the back, the explanation is there. The source, the context, the full argument. The Bible's visions work almost exactly this way. The strange thing is written, the footnote appears, sometimes in the same paragraph, sometimes within the same chapter, sometimes in the next verse. The problem is not that the footnotes are missing. The problem is that most readers close the book at the number and never turn to the back. Ezekiel 37 verse 11. The text turns to the back. These bones, says God to Ezekiel, are the whole house of Israel, not the individual dead of all ages, the whole house of Israel. A scattered, exiled, nationally dismembered people who have been saying, "Our bones are dried up, our hope is lost, we are cut off." The valley is not a graveyard. It is a picture of a nation. The scholar Moshe Greenberg, in his major commentary on Ezekiel, identifies this as a corporate, this-world statement about national restoration from Babylonian exile. The individual resurrection reading is a later theological development layered onto a passage that had already answered its own question. The text does not leave the reader without an answer. The answer is in verse 11. Most people have never been told it was there. If you are finding that the Bible is doing more of the interpretive work than you realized, share this video with someone who takes Scripture seriously. There is still a lot of catalog to cover. Let us take a breath and look at where we have been. Peter's sheep vision, the one most commonly cited as God removing the food laws, is interpreted later in the same chapter by Peter himself as a statement about people, not diet. We covered the Hebrew vocabulary most English readers have never seen, 5 distinct words for visionary experience, and a scarcity statement in 1 Samuel that told Israel something had gone spiritually silent. We traced the patriarchal visions, the covenantal fire with Abram, the staircase in Genesis 28 that was never a rope ladder, and Balaam's oracle from outside the Israelite tradition. And in this segment, we covered the 2 great prophets, Isaiah, undone and commissioned in a single scene, who used 3 layers of qualification because he refused to claim he had seen more than an appearance of a likeness. That is the first half. The second half covers the visions that came in clusters, the one vision that generated 3 competing theological traditions, and the moment the New Testament adds a new word and a new promise to the catalog. Ezekiel was careful to say he only saw an appearance of a likeness. What happens when the visions become harder to interpret? When the Bible's own answers get contested? Picture a city being rebuilt after a war. The streets are being cleared. The foundations are being laid. Scaffolding everywhere. But nobody has agreed yet on what the new building should look like. Now imagine someone in that city receives 8 architectural drawings in a single night, and every drawing has a caption. The 8 visions of Zechariah were not received across months or years. They arrived on one night. The text gives the date, the 24th day of the 11th month in the 2nd year of Darius. That translates to February 15th, 519 BCE. Jerusalem is being rebuilt after the Babylonian exile. The temple, destroyed in 587 BCE, is under reconstruction. The community is living in an unfinished city with an unclear future. Into that moment, Zechariah receives 8 visions in sequence, each one followed by an angelic interpreter who provides the caption. A man on a red horse among myrtle trees in a ravine, the horseman reporting that the whole earth is at rest. 4 horns and 4 craftsmen, the horns representing nations that scattered Israel, the craftsmen arriving to drive them out. A man with a measuring line, going to measure Jerusalem, told that the city will overflow with people and be surrounded by God's presence, rather than walls. Joshua the high priest in filthy garments before the angel of the Lord, an accuser standing to oppose him, his garments changed to clean robes, the sin removed. A golden lampstand flanked by 2 olive trees, identified by the angel as 2 anointed ones. A flying scroll 20 cubits long, carrying a curse over the land. A woman labeled wickedness, seated in a large basket vessel, carried off to Babylon. And 4 chariots emerging from between 2 bronze mountains, going out to the 4 points of the earth. 8 visions, 4 captions. Most scholars read the sequence as a literary arch, where the first and last visions mirror each other, the second and second to last mirror each other, and the central vision of Joshua's restored garments sits as the pivot. One night, one structured argument. The post-exilic community needed to be told that the rebuilding was the right move, that what looked like rubble was the beginning of something. If you have ever lived through a season that looked like wreckage and waited for someone to tell you it was a foundation, that is the season Zechariah's audience was sitting in. Zechariah's visions were not abstract revelations. They were addressed to specific people in a specific city with a specific problem. Think about what 8 captioned visions in a single night means. This is not a text that intends to mystify. This is a text that was trying to be understood. Now Daniel is a different kind of problem entirely. Daniel chapter 7. Daniel receives a dream vision and sees 4 great beasts rising from the sea. A winged lion, a bear with ribs in its mouth, a 4-headed leopard with 4 wings, and a 4th beast with iron teeth and 10 horns. Then the Ancient of Days is enthroned, white-haired, robes like white snow, a fiery throne before him, thousands upon thousands attending. The books are opened, the 4th beast is destroyed, and one like a son of man comes on the clouds of heaven and receives an eternal kingdom from the Ancient of Days. The text provides a partial interpretation at verse 17. These 4 great beasts are 4 kings that will arise from the earth. An angelic interpreter confirms this. So, the text has spoken, and then the debate begins. The scholar John Collins, in his major commentary on Daniel, identifies the 4 kingdoms as Babylon, Media, Persia, and Seleucid Greece, with the little horn of the 4th beast representing the 2nd century king Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who desecrated the Jerusalem temple in 167 BCE. On this reading, the vision was composed during the Maccabean crisis as a message of endurance to a community under persecution. A second mainstream position identifies the kingdoms as Babylon, combined Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome, with the little horn pointing to a future figure who has not yet appeared. A third reading, prominent in certain Reformed traditions, places the 4th kingdom as Rome and the little horn as the papacy. 3 positions, 3 timelines, 3 sets of consequences. But not one of these traditions is arguing that Daniel chapter 7 left the question entirely open. All 3 are arguing about how far the text's own answer extends into history. The disagreement is about the reach of an answer that is already there, not the absence of one. If you have ever heard 2 people quote the same chapter to argue opposite conclusions, this is the kind of text they were probably both reading. Does the New Testament clarify the picture? Every year, someone looks at an old photograph and notices something they missed the last 100 times. A face in the background, a shadow that was always there. Not because the photograph changed, but because they finally looked slowly enough. The New Testament introduces 3 distinct Greek words for visionary experience. One for a spectacle or visible phenomenon, one for a supernatural apparition, and one for a disclosure or unveiling. That third word is important because it is also the title of the last book of the Bible. Not revelations, plural, singular. A single disclosure of a single truth. The popular habit of treating Revelation as a disconnected collection of strange images is a genre mistake. The book announces itself as one thing from its very first word. On the day of Pentecost, Peter stands and quotes the prophet Joel. He uses Joel chapter 2, verse 28. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your young men will see visions. Your old men will dream dreams. What most readers have never been told is that Peter changes the word order. In Joel's original Hebrew, old men and dreams come first. Peter places young men and visions first. The rearrangement is deliberate. The writer of Acts was not transcribing carelessly. Peter front-loads the vision promise, making it the lead claim of the entire Pentecost announcement. The detail has been sitting in that text for 2,000 years. Most people have never been told it was there. Paul's Damascus Road experience is recorded 3 times in Acts, in chapters 9, 22, and 26. The 3 accounts vary in detail. In one, the companions hear a voice. In another, they do not. In one, they see a light. In another, they fall to the ground. Historians of ancient biography note that variation across multiple retellings of the same event was a recognized convention in first-century writing, not a sign of error. What stays constant across all three accounts is the identity of the voice and the commission given. Paul himself, writing to the Corinthians in his second letter, describes a separate experience, being caught up to the third heaven, hearing things he cannot repeat. He uses the Greek words for both an unveiling and an apparition in the same passage, and then he says nothing more about what he saw or heard. This is the only vision in the New Testament where the recipient explicitly withholds the content. The silence is not structural. Paul labels it and then closes the door. It is worth noticing that even this exception is explicitly marked as exceptional. If you have ever tried to describe the most important thing that ever happened to you and found that the words ran out, there is a kind of silence that falls over a courtroom when the verdict has already been read, and one person in the room missed it. Everyone else is gathering their things. The case is resolved. But they are still holding the question, waiting for something that already came. That is the experience of the famous vision passages most readers carry. The answer came. It is in the same chapter. The text already read the verdict. We just walked out before the clerk finished speaking. The book of Revelation opens with John on Patmos, in the Spirit on the Lord's day, hearing a loud voice like a trumpet behind him. He turns and sees one like a son of man standing among 7 golden lampstands. White hair, blazing eyes, feet like polished bronze, a two-edged sword from his mouth. The language echoes Daniel chapter 7 directly. John falls at the figure's feet as though dead. And then in chapter 1 verse 20, the text interprets itself. The mystery of the 7 stars that you saw in my right hand and of the 7 golden lampstands is this. The 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. The most visually dense opening vision in the New Testament explains its own central images in the same chapter. The book that most readers experience as the most inscrutable text in the Bible begins by interpreting its own symbols before the second chapter opens. That is not a coincidence. It is the pattern, and it has been there from Genesis 15. When people say a book is hard to understand, they usually mean one of two things. Either the book is genuinely complex, or they stopped reading before the explanation came. Across the catalog, Abram's covenant vision was interpreted in the same passage by the voice that appeared in it. Jacob's staircase was interpreted by the speech God gave above it. Samuel's night encounter was interpreted by morning. Isaiah's throne room was interpreted with a coal and a commission. Ezekiel's chariot was carefully qualified by the prophet himself. The dry bones were interpreted at verse 11. Zechariah's 8 visions were captioned by an angel for each one. Daniel's beasts were partially interpreted in the same chapter, with the debate centered on how far the answer extends, not on whether it exists. Peter's sheet was interpreted later in the same chapter. John's lampstands were identified in verse 20. The pattern holds. The exceptions exist. Paul's third heaven is an exception. He labeled it and closed the door. But it is worth noticing that even the exception was labeled. The text knew it was leaving something open. It said so. The first thing this catalog shows is that the Bible treats its own visions as self-explaining events. When a vision carries a message that needs to be understood, the interpretation almost always comes in the same paragraph, the same chapter, the same page. The reader is not expected to decode. The reader is expected to finish. The second thing, and this is worth sitting with, is that the most misread visions are not the most obscure ones. They are the most famous ones. Peter's sheet, Ezekiel's bones, Jacob's staircase. The passages that carry the most theological traffic are the ones where the traffic ran past the answer without stopping. The answer was there. It was not hidden. It came in the same chapter. And the third thing, the one worth holding on to, the Bible's visions were not recorded to be mysterious. They were recorded to be understood. Ezekiel did not write the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord because he wanted to confuse you. He wrote it because he was being precise as language allows for something that exceeded language. And precision, it turns out, looks a lot like mystery, until you read slowly. Peter came down from that rooftop in Joppa and walked into a Gentile's house. He did not go because a sheet had descended from the sky. He went because the sheet descended, and then the voice explained why. The vision was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a sentence. Acts 10 verse 28 was the period. If this catalog helped you find the text you did not know was there, subscribe to Biblepedia for more.